Today's topic is formatting and punctuating dialogue. And if you've got 5 minutes, I've got 5 tips to help you get it right. It's impossible to talk about improving our writing if we don't talk about punctuation once in a while. And every once in a while I like to go back and give a few tips about punctuating, and it also helps me to review punctuation for my own writing. Proper punctuation, in fact, does do 2 things for your writing. First, if you don't get it right, it can completely jumble and mix up the message so that your readers don't understand what you're trying to say to them. Punctuation is that important to get that message right. The second reason is that any writer who doesn't learn to punctuate properly is going to always be considered an amateur. And it's going to be noticeable by agents, editors, and yes, even readers will notice this. So today, I'm specifically going to talk about punctuating dialogue. And dialogue is used in both nonfiction and fiction writing. You tend to think about it as a novelist writing dialogue, but also nonfiction often uses the conventions of dialogue and therefore needs to know how to punctuate properly. If you don't punctuate and format your dialogue specifically properly, you're going to confuse your readers, and you don't want to confuse your readers. So that's the purpose of your formatting and punctuation for dialogue. Now, just before I get to my 5 tips for today, I think it's important to mention that there are going to be times when you will read something where you will see unconventional punctuation of dialogue. For example, best-selling writer Amar Towles, the author of A Man from Moscow and Lincoln Highway, among other things, uses an unconventional approach that uses em dashes. I don't recommend this for you. Now let's get to my tips. Tip number 1 is use quotation marks. Now, do I even need to say this? Well, I guess I do if you're going to be looking at punctuation of dialogue like Amar Towles uses. Now, we use in North America and some other parts of the world the double quotation marks. If you're looking at this from the UK, you're going to want to recheck some of these tips entirely because they're slightly different, but generally dialogue uses single quotation marks as opposed to the doubles. You probably already know this, but let's review. You enclose your dialogue in the quotation marks. This gives your reader a clear indication that someone is going to speak. I love chocolate, Sandy said. You can clearly see that that's what Sandy said. And I also want to make note here, though, that if it's a long piece of dialogue that requires more than 1 paragraph, you put a quotation mark at the beginning of the monologue, if you like, and at the beginning of each paragraph of that monologue, but you do not put any closing quotation marks at the end of the paragraph until you get to the very end of the dialogue itself. So if you have 3 paragraphs of dialogue, you put quotation mark at the beginning of the first paragraph, at the beginning of the second, at the beginning of the third, and at the end of the third. Tip number 2. Start a new paragraph for each speaker. Whenever another speaker begins speaking, it starts with a new paragraph. You never carry on with a second speaker in the same paragraph. This helps to distinguish each character's voice. Tip number 3. Other punctuation marks like commas and periods go inside the quotation marks. Now, this is a North American convention. If you're watching this from the UK, for example, you might want to recheck this. So the point is that commas and periods, whether or not they belong to the dialogue, belong inside the quotation marks, not outside. Tip number 4, use dialogue tags, but use them carefully. What I'm talking about are tags like said, he said, she said. Said is a dialogue tag. Now, their purpose is to attribute certain dialogue to specific characters to avoid confusing the reader. The bottom line for you when it comes to punctuating dialogue is you must never confuse your reader. The reader should be very clear about who's speaking at any given time. But there are some important things to consider when using dialogue tags. One of the important things to consider is that there are few good reasons to use anything except said. And I don't care what you've read anywhere online, if you are reading a book and it uses a whole plethora of dialogue tags, to not reuse said over and over again, it's going to become very tiresome for the reader. For example, there is no reason for a character to state, utter, scream, unless it's an actual scream. They don't scream dialogue. Sandy screamed. She didn't scream. There's no reason to say somebody verbalized or replied or even asked sometimes. Asked can be used from time to time as a dialogue tag, but said works perfectly well. It is unobtrusive. It helps the reader to understand who's speaking, but it doesn't get in the way of the action. Tip number 5, use other punctuation marks in dialogue with care. I'm talking about question marks, exclamation marks, em dashes, ellipsis points. All of these can be part of dialogue, but be very careful with how you use them. For example, what do you mean with a question mark? Inside the quotation marks, perfectly acceptable, necessary. I don't know, Emily trailed off. Look at the use of ellipsis points in that one. Ellipsis points within the dialogue means that somebody trailed off. You don't actually have to say that necessarily. In fact, Emily said would be perfectly fine and probably preferable. On the other hand, if another speaker interrupts the speaker, you use an em dash within the quotation marks. And then the next speaker carries on, and you know that the first speaker has been interrupted. They didn't just choose to not continue the sentence. And I'd like to give Lynn Truss, the author of Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, the last word on dialogue punctuation, or punctuation in general. Here's what she said. Proper punctuation is both the sign and the cause of clear thinking. Well, there are my 5 tips for today for punctuating dialogue. There are others, but these are the most important ones. Happy writing. Subscribe to Write, Fix, Repeat, and maybe I can help you improve your writing knowledge and skills. 5 tips at a time.